After the release of his landmark 1960 album, Giant Steps, Coltrane was on top of the jazz world. He would work tirelessly, constantly pushing his own boundaries and propel his music into new directions. He didn't know it at this time, but he only had 7 years left to live. "1961 was a huge year for John Coltrane, and the music poured out of him like fire. Coming on the heels of Giant Steps, he released 4 more giant albums, 3 for Atlantic Records and 1 for Impulse. His Atlantic releases, Coltrane Jazz, My Favorite Things, and Ole Coltrane, were each wildly inventive and unique. He was now remaking popular standards in his own original style, and one of his most famous recordings saw him completely reimagining a beloved show tune from The Sound of Music. His version turned the Rodgers and Hammerstein classic into an Indian-infused raga of swirling notes. My Favorite Things was Coltrane's first recording on soprano sax. It was a perfect blend of radical and popular, pushing into abstract territory while appealing to mainstream audiences as well. "1961 also saw Coltrane's lineup change with the addition of a second bass. A few players rotated in and out, and you can hear this on the Spanish-influenced Ole. Coltrane also added a second sax player, a young protege of bass guru Charles Mingus named Eric Dolphy. This new quintet benefited from a residency at the Village Vanguard that gave the group a home base and allowed them to do extensive live recordings. Both Coltrane and Dolphy were interested in what was being dubbed the new thing, an avant-garde jazz led by Ornette Coleman. Coltrane's new sound, with Dolphy, sharply divided the jazz world, with purists labeling their creations anti-jazz. In 1962, Eric Dolphy left the group, and Jimmy Garrison joined to become Coltrane's primary bassist. Rounding out the rhythm section with McCoy Tyner on piano and Elvin Jones on drums, this quartet became known as the Classic Quartet. These 4 incredible musicians would continue to push their music towards the spiritual, although some of the criticisms of the Coltrane-Dolphy sound may have gotten to John. The quartet's recordings for the next couple years found the musicians playing more conservatively, recording more ballads. Trane even collaborated on an album with swing master Duke Ellington, a historic meeting of 2 incredible musicians from different generations of jazz. Although Coltrane's studio recordings were much more tame during this period, his group continued to balance live performances with standard bebop and more avant-garde material. You can hear those 2 worlds colliding on the 1963 album Impressions, a combination of live and studio cuts. In 1963, John met pianist Alice MacLeod, and they began a partnership in music and spirituality. The 2 moved in together while John was still married to Naima, and over the next few years they had 3 children, John Jr., Ravi, and Oren. It would be 1966 before John officially divorced Naima. In 1965, Coltrane released an album with only 4 parts that made up a kind of suite. This album was highly influenced by Eastern religions and philosophies, and became the thesis and summary of John Coltrane's life and work. A Love Supreme would become one of his best-selling albums, a defining one that influenced rock groups like the Byrds and Santana. Within 5 years, it had sold more than 500,000 copies, far outpacing typical Coltrane albums, which would sell around 30,000.
A love supreme, a love supreme, a love supreme, a love supreme.
A Love Supreme would land a spot on Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Albums of All Time, clocking a number 47 spot. In the 2020 update of this list, the album had only slipped to a number 66 spot, almost 55 years after it was released. When the legendary rock critic Lester Bangs' wake was held at the New York punk club CBGB, A Love Supreme was playing. The following year, 1966, Coltrane followed up by taking his music even farther, releasing his most audacious work at the time. Ascension would be a defining work of his later career, and one that deeply divided critics and fans. Here, Coltrane abandoned the quartet format, instead layering up an 11-piece ensemble, including 2 basses and multiple horn players such as Freddie Hubbard on trumpet and Pharoah Sanders on tenor sax. Ascension consisted of just one 40-minute piece. There was no set key, no set meter. This was pure free jazz. And while it has been hailed and hated, some critics have over time come around, and many have at least recognized the importance of this record. His remaining albums would be variations on the overriding theme of love and universal consciousness. Meditations would be his last recording with the classic quartet, with the additions of Pharoah Sanders and Rashid Ali. Kulu Se Mama was to be his last album he released during his lifetime. Expression would be released in September of 1967, just after what would have been his 41st birthday. He died in July of 1967. In his final days, Coltrane's health was visibly failing, to the point that other musicians had noticed. In retrospect, it seems obvious that with his albums, Coltrane was trying to reach a higher plane, the next phase of existence. His performances of the last few years had found him fully entranced as he played. He was completely lost in his music, and yet lost doesn't seem like the appropriate word. Coltrane knew exactly where he was going. Several posthumous releases would follow in the years after his death. His second wife, Alice, found tapes of recordings, and these would extend his legacy. Interstellar Space, released in 1974, was an entire album of duets between himself and drummer Rashid Ali. It was both minimalistic, but also explosive, and indeed, Interstellar Space feels a bit like a message from beyond. John Coltrane not only redefined saxophone playing, but for many musicians, he redefined the way they approach playing other instruments as well. In 1995, the U.S. Postal Service dedicated a special commemorative stamp to him. In 1997, he was honored with the Grammy Award for Lifetime Achievement. In 2001, the National Endowment for the Arts chose his rendition of My Favorite Things as one of its 360 Songs of the Century, and in 2007, Coltrane was bestowed with a Pulitzer Prize for his innovation and influence. It's very likely that all of those honors coming after his death wouldn't have bothered John Coltrane. He really seems to have been about serving a higher purpose. He was known to have said, "I know that there are bad forces that bring suffering to others and misery to the world. I want to be the opposite force. I want to be the force which is truly for good." Trane's music still speaks to us today, but for his fans who want to get a little bit closer to the legend, there's a sort of pilgrimage you can make to his home state of North Carolina. I'll cover that in my next video. And if you like these videos about Coltrane and other musicians from North Carolina, please give them a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks!